The zip tie bit into my wrists as Mike Reed's boots scuffed the concrete behind me. I had one jagged piece of molding and 30 seconds before he realized I wasn't helpless. If I didn't cut through, I'd be worth more to my father as a tax write-off than a daughter. The crate hit Mike's shins with a crack, my only shot. His wrench clattered to the floor, but two more grabbed me before I reached the dock. The burner phone in my palm was my last chance. $75,000 or nothing. That's what I was worth. The scent of damp concrete and sour mildew clung to the back of Sarah's throat, a thick, suffocating veil that tasted of failure. She pressed her wrists against the jagged edge of the floor molding, sawing the plastic zip tie with rhythmic, frantic precision. Every stroke sent a vibration through her bones, a dull thrumming that echoed the pounding of her heart. The jagged wood bit into her skin, but she ignored the warm prickle of blood. Pain was just data, a sensory input to be managed. She needed to be free before the voices in the next room reached a consensus on her life expectancy. Beyond the thin plywood door, voices collided in a messy roar. The warehouse was a cavern of echoes, amplifying every grunt and curse. "We didn't sign up for a federal headache, Mike," a gravelly voice barked. This was Dave, the one with the nervous twitch and the smell of stale cigarettes. "Shut your mouth and hold the wrench," Mike snapped. His boots crunched over shattered glass, the sound sharp and crystalline against the metal rafters. The plan shifts when the leverage shifts. We wait for the call. If Sterling wants his princess back, he pays the entry fee. Sarah's breath hitched, but she didn't let it break her rhythm. She twisted her hands, forcing the plastic notch against the sharpest splinter of the molding. The tie groaned, frayed, and finally snapped with a dull pop that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. She didn't pause to massage her bruised flesh or the deep purple welts forming on her wrists. Instead, she crawled toward the stack of rusted paint cans blocking the only window, her movements fluid and silent. "He isn't calling," the first man yelled, his shadow flickering under the door gap like a dying candle. "The girl is a liability now. We're sitting ducks in a box made of tin." Sarah gripped the edge of a heavy crate, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed a weapon or a way out before the heavy thud of Mike's footsteps reached her. Her fingers brushed cold steel, a discarded screwdriver. She palmed the handle, the weight grounding her. The argument outside escalated into a cacophony of scraping chairs and curses, masking the sound of her rising to her feet. One chance remained to vanish before the lock turned. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, battered brass of her grandfather's compass. Click, snap. The sound was tiny, a metallic heartbeat. She was finding her bearings. The door groaned on its hinges, the rusted metal shrieking a warning. Mike Reed stepped into the room, his frame silhouetted against the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the main floor. He held a heavy pipe wrench in his right hand, the tool looking like a natural extension of his scarred, swollen knuckles. He didn't look like a mastermind. He looked like a man who had spent 20 years under the chassis of a truck and had finally decided to break something he couldn't fix. "Still here, I see," Mike grunted, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small space. He didn't notice the snapped plastic ties hidden behind her back. He smelled of diesel and cheap coffee, a scent that Sarah found more honest than the expensive colognes of her father's boardroom. "You're a quiet one, Sarah. Most people in your shoes would be screaming for their daddy. But you just sit there like you're calculating the interest on a loan." Sarah didn't answer. She watched the way his weight shifted, the way he favored his left leg. She waited until he was 2 steps into the room, his attention momentarily snagged by the way the light glinted off the screwdriver she'd palmed. You think that's gonna save you? Mike asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sarah didn't give him the satisfaction of a verbal response. Instead, she threw her entire weight into the heavy wooden crate beside her. It was filled with rusted iron fittings, weighing at least 80 pounds. With a grunt of effort, she sent it sliding across the slick concrete. It caught Mike square in the shins with a sickening crack of wood on bone. He let out a strangled yelp, his knees buckling as the wrench clattered to the floor. The sound was a heavy thud clang that echoed through the warehouse. Sarah didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She lunged past him, her boots skidding on the grit-covered floor. She burst through the door, her lungs burning as she hit the open space of the warehouse. The air here was colder, smelling of salt and old machinery. To her left, the loading dock stood open, a rectangle of gray New Jersey sky offering the only hope of escape. She sprinted, her footsteps sounding like a drum roll on the concrete. The warehouse felt like a labyrinth of towering steel shelves and shadowed corners. Sarah could see the loading dock, the industrial roll-up door halfway open, revealing the dismal, rain-slicked world outside. Freedom was less than 50 feet away. She could almost taste the cold, wet air. "Get her!" Mike's voice roared from behind, choked with pain and fury. Sarah pushed her legs harder, her muscles screaming. She was 20 feet from the door when two shadows detached themselves from the darkness near the shipping office. Dave and Steve. They didn't move like professionals. They moved like desperate men. Dave lunged first, his fingers catching the sleeve of her jacket. Sarah spun, trying to use her momentum to break his grip. But Steve was already there, his heavy frame slamming into her side. The impact sent her sprawling. Her shoulder hit the concrete with a thud that knocked the wind from her lungs. She rolled, trying to scramble back to her feet, but they were on her. Dave's hands were like iron clamps on her arms, and Steve threw his weight across her legs. "Let go," Sarah hissed, her voice raw. She thrashed, her elbow connecting with something soft. Dave's ribs. He groaned, but didn't let go. In the blur of the struggle, Sarah felt a hard, rectangular shape against her hip. Mike's burner phone. In his haste to intimidate her earlier, he had leaned too close, and the device was tucked loosely in his jacket pocket. As Steve wrestled her wrists together, Sarah's fingers darted out. It was a move born of pure instinct, a sleight of hand she hadn't known she possessed. She swiped the phone and tucked it into the waistband of her trousers, the cold plastic biting into her skin just as Mike reached the group, limping heavily. "Enough!" Mike barked, his face a mask of sweat and rage. He grabbed Sarah by the hair, forcing her head back. "You want to play rough? Fine. Let's see how much your old man thinks your teeth are worth." They dragged her back toward the center of the warehouse, her heels scraping twin tracks in the dust. They didn't notice the bulge of the phone. They didn't notice that while they had caught her body, she had just stolen their only line of communication. The center of the warehouse was dominated by a single shipping pallet. On top of it sat a pristine birthday cake, its white frosting gleaming under the dying light. It was a surreal sight, a splash of domesticity in a tomb of industry. The sugar smelled sickly sweet, clashing with the metallic tang of the air. Mike shoved Sarah into a chair near the pallet and pulled out his primary phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed a number he clearly knew by heart. "Put it on speaker," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I want to hear him." Mike glared at her, but pressed the button. The ringing tone was loud, echoing off the high ceiling. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, flat, Midwestern, and utterly devoid of warmth. Julian Sterling. "Yes?" Julian said, as if he were answering a mundane inquiry about a shipping delay. "We have your daughter, Sterling," Mike said, his voice dropping into a staged growl. "5 million, unmarked. By midnight, or she starts coming back in pieces." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah held her breath, her chest tight. She imagined her father in his glass office, checking his Patek Philippe watch, perhaps adjusting the silk shirt he wore for the 12th of the month. 5 million? Julian finally spoke, and there was a hint of a dry chuckle in his voice. "Mike. I assume it's Mike. You clearly haven't looked at the latest quarterly reports. Sarah has been a difficult asset to manage lately. Her lifestyle, her independence. It's created a significant amount of friction in the machine." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" Mike asked, his confusion evident. "I'm saying that 5 million is a poor return on investment," Julian said. "As a daughter, she's a liability. As a kidnapping victim, however, she's a very clean tax write-off. I'll offer you $75,000 for the trouble of disposing of the remains. It's a generous fee for a cleanup crew. Take it or leave it. I have a merger to finalize." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the warehouse itself. Sarah stared at the birthday cake, the white frosting sweating in the stagnant air. She wasn't a daughter. She was a depreciating asset, and her father had just liquidated her. The temperature in the warehouse began to plummet as the nor'easter finally made landfall, the wind howling against the corrugated metal walls like a wounded animal. The sound was a constant, rhythmic rattling that set Sarah's teeth on edge. Inside, the air turned brittle and cold, turning their breath into small puffs of white mist. Mike Reed was no longer the confident kidnapper. He paced the perimeter of the pallet, his snub-nosed revolver held loosely at his side. He looked smaller, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of Julian's rejection had physically crushed him. 75,000, Mike whispered, the words puffing out in the cold. "That won't even cover the gas and the bribes. He's mocking us. He's mocking me." Sarah watched him, her mind working through the variables. She needed to shift the leverage. "Mike, look at me. He's not going to pay. You know that now. But I can. I have accounts, private ones. I can wire you 2 million right now. We walk away. No one else has to know." Mike stopped pacing. His eyes, rimmed with red from lack of sleep, settled on her. "You'd do that, after we snatched you?" "I'd do it to survive," Sarah said. "It's a business transaction, simple as that." Mike hesitated, then nodded to Dave. "Get her laptop. Let's see the color of her money." They brought her the slim silver device, her fingers stiff with cold as she opened the lid. The screen's glow was a harsh blue in the darkness. She navigated to her private offshore portal, her heart thumping. This was her play. This was her way out. She entered her credentials, her fingers flying over the keys. Access denied. She tried again. Account frozen by primary guardian. A cold dread, sharper than the New Jersey winter, settled in her gut. She tried her secondary account. Frozen. Her investment portfolio liquidated. "Well?" Mike stepped closer, the revolver's barrel glinting. He froze them," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "He didn't just walk away. He cut my legs out from under me. I have nothing." Julian hadn't just refused the ransom. He had ensured she had no way to buy her own freedom. He had stripped her of her identity and her resources in a single, cold-blooded move. She was truly alone in the dark. The silence of the warehouse was shattered by the sound of a heavy vehicle slamming into the loading dock doors. The metal groaned and buckled, the sound of tearing steel like a scream. "What the hell is that?" Dave yelled, reaching for a shotgun leaning against a crate. Before he could level the weapon, the side door exploded inward. A group of men, dressed in mismatched tactical gear and smelling of cheap beer and old grease, poured into the space. These weren't professionals. They were the debt collectors Mike had been dodging for months, tipped off by some leak in his crew that a big payday was coming. "Reed," the leader shouted, a man with a jagged scar across his nose. "We heard you hit the jackpot. We're here for our cut, all of it." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Mike dived behind a stack of tires, returning fire with his revolver. The pop, pop, pop of the small caliber gun was drowned out by the roar of the debt collectors' shotguns. Wood splinters flew through the air as crates were shredded. Sarah didn't wait to be caught in the crossfire. She rolled off her chair and crawled toward the shadows of aisle 4. The floor was a minefield of shattered glass and dropped tools. Above her, the flickering lights hummed and buzzed, occasionally dying out completely before surging back to life. She saw an opening, a gap between two heavy shelving units. She lunged for it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, the sounds of the brawl were a cacophony of grunts, the heavy thud of fists hitting flesh, and the metallic clack of weapons being reloaded. The warehouse had become a battlefield, and she was the prize that everyone was willing to kill for, but no one was willing to protect. She reached the loading bay, the air here thick with the smell of burnt powder and ozone. The gray light of the storm filtered through the gaps in the buckled door. She was almost there when a hand caught her ankle, dragging her backward. She let out a sharp cry as her chin hit the concrete. She spun around to see a debt collector, his face twisted in a grin that revealed yellowed teeth. He held a long, serrated hunting knife, the blade dull and stained. "Not so fast, sweetheart," he hissed. "You're the golden ticket." He lunged, the knife whistling through the air. Sarah rolled to the side, her fingers searching the floor for anything she could use. Her hand closed around the cold, heavy cylinder of a fire extinguisher that had been knocked from its wall bracket during the initial breach. As the man lunged again, Sarah swung the extinguisher with every ounce of strength she had left. She didn't aim. She just swung. The heavy red tank connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thunk. He didn't even scream. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. He hit the floor hard, the knife clattering away into the darkness. Sarah stood over him, her chest heaving, the fire extinguisher heavy in her trembling hands. The smell of the man's sweat and the metallic tang of the extinguisher's paint filled her senses. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a survivor. She dropped the tank, the hollow clang echoing through the bay, and turned back toward the shadows. She wasn't out yet, but she was still breathing. She retreated into the deepest corner of the warehouse, hidden behind a stack of rusted engine blocks. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to press them against the cold metal to make them stop. She reached into her waistband and pulled out Mike's stolen burner phone. The screen flickered to life. She opened the GPS app, her eyes scanning the map. She expected to see the blue and red lights of the local police department circling the block. She expected rescue. Instead, she saw a single black dot circling the warehouse with predatory precision. A black SUV. She zoomed in, her brow furrowed. The vehicle didn't have the markings of a government agency. It was a high-end, armored Suburban, the kind used by private security firms. Specifically, the kind used by Miller and Associates, the liquidation squad her father kept on a permanent retainer for sensitive corporate restructuring. A cold realization washed over her, more chilling than the nor'easter. These weren't rescuers. They were the cleanup crew Julian had mentioned on the phone. They weren't there to save the asset. They were there to insure the asset, and everyone who had touched it ceased to exist. He didn't just walk away. Sarah whispered to the shadows, her voice a ghost of a sound. He sent the butchers. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Her father wasn't just abandoning her, he was erasing her. To Julian Sterling, a kidnapped daughter was a mess. A dead daughter, killed in a tragic warehouse fire alongside a group of known criminals, was a clean narrative. It was a strategic pivot. The first shot from the liquidation squad wasn't a warning. It was a muffled thwip, a silenced high-caliber round that shattered the window of the shipping office. Sarah watched from her hiding spot as the professionals moved in. They didn't shout. They didn't posture. They moved like smoke, their silhouettes crisp and efficient against the flickering lights. They carried short-barreled rifles equipped with suppressors and thermal optics. One of Mike's men, Steve, stepped into a shaft of light, his shotgun raised. Before he could even register the movement in the doorway, his chest erupted in a spray of red. He fell backward without a sound, his boots drumming a brief, frantic rhythm on the concrete before going still. Then came the debt collectors. The man with the scar on his nose tried to run for the loading dock. A single shot caught him in the back of the head, and he crumpled into a heap of denim and leather. It wasn't a fight. It was a harvest. The professionals were moving through the warehouse, clearing each aisle with a terrifying, mechanical regularity. They were killing everyone, kidnappers and debt collectors alike. They didn't care about the ransom. They didn't care about the ledger. They were there to sanitize the site. Sarah felt a hand clamp over her mouth, and her heart nearly stopped. She prepared to fight, to use the screwdriver she still had tucked in her sleeve. But a familiar scowl met her eyes. "Quiet," Mike hissed, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He looked terrified, the bravado of the kidnapper completely stripped away. "Those aren't cops. They're hitters." "I know," Sarah whispered as he released his hand. "My father sent them. They're here to kill us all, Mike. No witnesses, no loose ends." Mike looked at the bodies littering the floor, then back at Sarah. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a paycheck. He looked at her like a fellow passenger on a sinking ship. "The sub-basement," Mike said, gesturing toward a heavy steel door near the back of the aisle. "It's an old bomb shelter from the 50s. Reinforced concrete. They'll have a harder time getting through that." A flashbang grenade detonated near the front of the warehouse, the blinding white light and ear-splitting crack vibrating through Sarah's very bones. The smell of magnesium and scorched air filled the room. "Go!" Mike shoved her toward the stairs. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran, her boots pounding the metal treads of the staircase as the first incendiary grenades were tossed into the warehouse behind them. The orange glow of the rising fire cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. She was no longer running from Mike. She was running with him. In the cold, calculating world of Julian Sterling, the enemy of my enemy was the only ally she had left. The sub-basement was a tomb of cold air and stagnant water. The walls were thick, damp concrete that seemed to suck the light from Mike's small flashlight. Above them, the muffled thud, thud, thud of the liquidation squad's footsteps echoed through the ceiling, followed by the roar of the fire as it took hold of the upper floors. "We have 20 minutes, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the small space. She pointed to a series of red canisters the mercenaries had dropped near the stairwell before they retreated. "They're dousing the place with accelerant." They're going to burn the whole block to the ground to make sure nothing is left. Mike slumped against a rusted generator, his revolver shaking in his hand. We're dead. There's no way out of here, Sarah. That door is the only way up, and they're sitting on it. Sarah didn't listen. Her eyes were fixed on a dull gray metal cabinet in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of rotting pallets. It was a shipyard mainframe terminal, a relic from the days when this warehouse was the hub of the New Jersey docks. Maybe not, Sarah said, her fingers already reaching for the battered brass compass in her pocket. Click, snap. The sound grounded her, clearing the fog of panic. This terminal. It's still hardwired to the old Port Authority grid. If I can get in, I can access the Sterling Corporation's backdoor protocols. What good does that do? Mike asked. You said he froze your accounts. He froze my accounts, Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a cold, hard light. But he can't freeze the corporate contingency funds, not without a board vote. And those funds are moved through a series of shadow accounts designed for emergency use. She sat at the terminal, the keys thick with dust. She began to type, her movements precise and rhythmic. The screen flickered to life, a series of green text scrolling across the black background. The smell of warm electronics and ozone filled the air. What are you doing? Mike asked, stepping closer. I'm buying your loyalty, Mike, Sarah said without looking up. I'm transferring $10 million of my father's money into your offshore accounts. If we get out of here, you're a rich man. If we don't, well, at least Julian loses the money. Mike watched the screen, his mouth slightly open. You can really do that. I built these protocols, Mike. My father thought I was just a clerk. He forgot that I'm the one who knows where all the bodies are buried. The progress bar on the screen began to crawl forward. 10%, 20%, 30%. Above them, the ceiling groaned as the fire intensified. The smell of smoke was beginning to seep through the vents, thick and acrid. The heavy steel door at the top of the stairs groaned as someone began to force it. The sound of a hydraulic ram echoed through the sub-basement. They're coming, Mike said, leveling his revolver. Hold them off, Sarah commanded. Just 5 more minutes. The door buckled and flew open. Robert Miller, the leader of the liquidation squad, stepped into the doorway. He looked like a machine, his face obscured by a gas mask, his rifle held with terrifying steadiness. Target sighted. Miller's voice crackled through his suit's comms. Mike fired, the pop of his revolver sounding pathetic against the concrete. Miller didn't even flinch. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, taking cover behind a concrete pillar. Sarah looked up from the screen, her eyes darting around the room. She saw a thick, rusted pipe running along the ceiling directly above Miller's position. A steam pipe, still pressurized from the warehouse's ancient boiler system. Mike, the pipe! Hit the valve! She screamed. Mike didn't ask questions. He shifted his aim and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The third bullet struck the rusted brass valve, shearing it clean off. A wall of white, scalding steam erupted from the pipe with a deafening roar. The sub-basement was instantly filled with a blinding, searing mist. Miller let out a strangled cry as the 300-degree vapor cooked through his tactical gear. He fell back, his rifle clattering to the floor, as he scrambled blindly for the exit. Sarah turned back to the screen. 95%. 98%. 99%. Transaction complete. For a fleeting second, Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She had done it. She had hit Julian where it hurt most. She had taken his money and used it to save herself. But then, the screen turned a violent, pulsing red. Protocol poison pill activated. Sarah's heart stopped. She stared at the screen, her fingers frozen on the keys. "What is it?" Mike asked, coughing as the steam began to dissipate, replaced by the thickening black smoke of the fire. He knew. Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "He knew I'd try this. He didn't just freeze the accounts, Mike. He set a trap. The moment that transfer hit the final gateway, it triggered a flag with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. It didn't just send the money. It sent a full confession, signed with my digital signature, admitting to the kidnapping, the embezzlement, and the theft of corporate secrets." She slumped back in the chair, the cold light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. "He's not just killing me, Mike. He's framing me. By the time the fire is out, the world will think I was the mastermind behind my own kidnapping, trying to fleece my father for millions before I accidentally died in the blaze." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a low, mournful sound that grew louder with every passing second. But they weren't the sirens of a rescue. They were the sirens of the law, coming to arrest a woman who had already been condemned by her own blood. The smoke was now a thick, black curtain that hung from the ceiling, stinging their eyes and clawing at their throats. The sub-basement was becoming an oven. "We have to go," Mike said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "The FBI is 5 minutes out. If we're here when they arrive, we're done." Sarah looked at the mainframe one last time. She saw the poison pill protocol scrolling through its final lines. Julian had thought of everything. He had turned her own intelligence against her, using her survival instincts to seal her fate. "There's a freight elevator," Sarah said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "It leads to a service tunnel that comes out near the old pier. But it's locked with a mechanical deadbolt. We don't have the key." She looked toward the corner of the room where the old paint locker stood. She remembered the smell of the warehouse from earlier, the chemical tang of solvents. "Get the paint thinner," she ordered Mike. "The high-strength stuff, and that blowtorch on the workbench." She didn't wait for him to move. She ran to the locker, her fingers fumbling with the latch. She grabbed a gallon jug of industrial-grade solvent and lugged it toward the elevator doors. "What are you doing?" Mike asked, his voice tight with panic. "Chemistry," Sarah said. She poured the solvent directly into the lock mechanism, the clear liquid hissing as it hit the rusted metal. The smell was overpowering, a sweet, sickly scent that made her dizzy. "The solvent will eat through the grease and the rust. Then we heat it." Mike handed her the torch. She clicked the igniter, and a blue flame roared to life. She held the tip of the flame against the lock, the metal beginning to glow a dull red. The solvent inside began to boil, the pressure building until the internal tumblers, weakened by the chemical bath, finally surrendered. With a heavy clunk, the deadbolt slid back. They scrambled into the elevator, the ancient motor groaning as it began to descend into the darkness of the service tunnel. Behind them, the sub-basement was swallowed by a wall of flame as the main floor above finally collapsed. The tunnel was a narrow, dripping tube of brick and shadows. They ran for what felt like miles, their breath coming in ragged gasps until they finally burst out into the cold, salt-sprayed air of the New Jersey shoreline. The nor'easter was in full force now, the rain a horizontal sheet that blurred the world into a gray smudge. In the distance, the warehouse was a pillar of orange fire against the black sky. Dozens of police cars and fire trucks were swarming the site, their lights a frantic dance of red and blue. Sarah watched as a group of men in tactical gear, the remains of the liquidation squad, were led away in handcuffs. The FBI had arrived just in time to catch the kidnappers fleeing the scene. Julian's plan had worked perfectly, except for one small detail. She was still alive. "What now?" Mike asked, his face streaked with soot and rain. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see an asset or a victim. He saw a leader. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the battered brass compass. Click, snap. The sound was sharp, clear, and final. "Now," Sarah said, her voice as cold as the Atlantic. "We go to the Hamptons. My father is throwing a party. It would be rude not to attend." The Sterling estate was a monument to ego, a sprawling glass and stone fortress perched on the edge of the Atlantic, its windows glowing with the warm, golden light of 100 chandeliers. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne, a stark contrast to the salt and smoke Sarah still carried in her hair. She moved through the shadows of the manicured gardens, Mike and his 2 remaining men following her lead. They moved like ghosts, their dark clothing making them invisible against the manicured hedges. "The side door," Sarah whispered. "It's biometric. He hasn't revoked my access yet because he thinks I'm a pile of ash in Newark." She pressed her thumb against the glass pad. A soft green light flickered, and the door clicked open with a polite, mechanical hiss. They slipped inside, the silence of the private wing a weight of its own. Sarah led them toward Julian's study, a room she had spent her childhood fearing. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read, and the air smelled of expensive cigars and old money. She sat at her father's desk, the mahogany cold under her fingertips. She didn't look for money. She didn't look for jewelry. She went straight for the hidden safe behind the portrait of her grandfather. She entered the code. Her own birthday, a final, cruel irony. The safe door swung open. Inside was a single, black leather binder. The ledger. It wasn't a digital file. Julian was too smart for that. It was a physical record of every illegal labor practice, every bribed official, and every liquidated competitor that had built the Sterling Empire. It was the heart of the machine. "You got it?" Mike asked, his eyes wide as he saw the contents. "I have everything," Sarah said. She turned on the desk's high-speed scanner. One by one, she began to feed the pages into the machine. She wasn't sending them to an offshore account. She was sending them to the one person who had been trying to nail Julian for a decade, David Brooks at the Department of Justice. She was halfway through the ledger when the door opened. Julian Sterling stepped into the room, his silver hair perfectly slicked back, his white silk shirt pristine. He stopped, his eyes settling on Sarah. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look afraid. He looked disappointed. "Sarah," he said, his voice a smooth, operatic baritone. "You always were a persistent girl. It's a shame you couldn't apply that tenacity to something more productive." "The merger's over, Julian," Sarah said, her voice steady as the scanner continued its rhythmic whir click. "The ledger is already at the DOJ. By tomorrow morning, the Sterling Corporation won't exist, and neither will you." Julian walked toward the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the scanner, then at the binder. "You think this matters? I am the mountain, Sarah. You are just a stone trying to roll uphill. I'll be out on bail before the sun comes up, and you'll be in a federal cell for the embezzlement I so kindly documented for you." "Maybe," Sarah said, rising to her feet. She leaned across the desk, her face inches from his. "But I'm not the only one here, Julian." Mike and his men stepped from the shadows, their faces grim and soot-stained. They didn't have guns. They didn't need them. Their presence alone was a testament to Julian's failure. He had tried to buy their silence with blood, and instead, he had given them a reason to fight. "You're a poor judge of character, Dad," Sarah said. "You thought they were just nuts and bolts. But it turns out even nuts and bolts can break the machine if you push them too hard." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. A dozen federal agents, led by a tired-looking man with a coffee-stained tie, burst into the room. "Julian Sterling?" David Brooks asked, his voice rasping from years of frustration. "You're under arrest for racketeering, labor violations, and conspiracy to commit murder." Julian didn't fight. He didn't scream. He simply adjusted his tie, checking the number on his hem. "This is a temporary setback. My lawyers will—" "Your lawyers are already being detained, Julian," Brooks said. "We have the ledger, and we have a witness." He looked at Sarah. Sarah didn't say a word. She watched as they placed the handcuffs on her father's wrists, the cold steel a perfect match for the man himself. She watched as they led him away, his empire crumbling with every step he took. She walked out onto the terrace, the cool Atlantic breeze catching her hair. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. Below her, the waves crashed against the rocks, a rhythmic, eternal sound that made everything else feel small.